So what about the parsnip webworm? Again, staggeringly different, entirely not what we expected, and not like any vertebrate P450. We found CYP6AB3, again, not a very euphonious name. That's the name of the enzyme that in the gut of the parsnip webworm that breaks down the most abundant franticoumarin in its host plants. It's a chemical called impratorin. It has this long tail on it. It's the most predictable, most abundant franticoumarin, and it is the only franticoumarin handled by this enzyme. In fact, it's the only one of 2 chemicals that this enzyme, in all of the chemicals in parsnips, this enzyme is extremely specialized for metabolizing just this one compound. But if all you eat is parsnip morning, noon, and night for every meal of every day of your life, there are few surprises. And this is an extremely specialized enzyme that's very well suited to the very predictable diet of this highly specialized species. Okay, so we found amazing adaptations that allow the webworm to feed on parsnips. But is this coevolution? It's clear the plant has been a selective agent on the insect, but is the insect a selective agent on plant toxicity? Does the chemistry of the plant change with the insect? And for evolution to occur, much less coevolution, there has to be a genetic basis for these traits. So that's when Art and I decided to apply the methods of quantitative genetics to estimate the proportion of variation in the population that is due to genetic factors and therefore available for selection. And in fact, the chemistry of the plant, for the most part, is controlled genetically, and there's tremendous potential for evolution because there's a lot of genetic variation. And with one exception, the same is true of the detoxification capacity of the insect. So the genetic wherewithal for coevolution is there. As for whether it happens, we planted out in the field chemically different plants with different genotypes and found, in fact, using quantitative genetics, that in the presence of webworms, the chemistry does change within a single generation. In the presence of webworms, plants start making more of these 2 franticoumarins, bergaptan and sfondin, and without webworms, those amounts are decreased. And it turns out, in fact, those are the 2 franticoumarins this caterpillar is less comfortable with. This one in particular is one that's very expensive for the plant to make. It's a different biosynthetic pathway. In the absence of webworms, there's less need for this chemical, and it's expensive. So evidence, in fact, that insects are a selective agent. But are they co-evolving? Can you see the footprint of coevolution in different populations? So that's when we began moving out. All this time we've been working, my aversion to driving, in basically a field that's 2 miles from my house. Clearly to compare populations, we had to go to other places. So we went all the way to Peatone in Illinois and Charleston. Actually, there's a Minnesota population as well. It's not a hard plant to find. It grows in waste places, roadside. There's a donut shop parking lot, which has some perks to it, too, visiting these populations. And examined the chemistry of the plants and the insects, and found in every population there's a remarkably good correspondence of the chemical profile of the plant and the detoxification capacity of the insect. So there's matching of the ability of the plant to defend itself and the ability of the insect to circumvent those. And that, to us, looked like the result of essentially a stalemate in a coevolutionary arms race, where the genetic wherewithal to respond is present, and this is what you end up with. But one could still argue that this is really the result of the insect adapting to the plant and the plant chemical variation due to entirely other factors. How can you rule that out? Can you really watch evolution as it happens? Well, as it turns out, we basically used a time machine, metaphorical time machine, to track this process. The process being, parsnip webworms are not native to North America. They are what are called invasive species. Parsnip is an invasive species. It's a weed from Europe. Parsnip webworms and parsnips were long acquainted in Europe. The parsnips came in 1609. In 1869, a guy named Bethune found a caterpillar. He thought he discovered a new species. It wasn't until 1888 that C.V. Riley, who had traveled the world, recognized that the insect that had been described as a new species was actually European Depresseria pasnicella. So we knew more or less exactly when parsnip webworms first arrived in the U.S. how do we go back in time? Well, phracnocoumarins in the parsnip seeds are sealed in oil glands called vidi. They're sealed tightly shut. You can actually go find a plant that's 100 years old, peel off the vidi, crack them open, extract the phracnocoumarins, and find out what the chemistry of the plant was from 100 years ago. And people collect herbarium specimens. So we were able to, in fact, that there were webworms, the evidence of webworms was abundant. Well, usually it's silk. They silk the web. You could always see the silk after the caterpillars feed. Sometimes they preserve the caterpillars, not often. But Art went through herbarium pages to look for evidence of webworm damage, and then we took some seeds and measured the chemistry. So we seed samples from North America, compared them to webworm chemistry prior to the establishment of webworms in the US, compared them to European herbaria from those same periods, and then looked at the change in the chemistry of the plants here and in Europe with and without, before and after webworms. So what we found, we found no evidence in herbarium specimens of webworm presence before 1890. Infestations grew dramatically after that. And so did the phracnocoumarins. Every phracnocoumarin, except for isopimpinellin, significantly increased after webworm introduction. And in fact, prior to introduction, the phracnocoumarin content of North American parsnips was lower than that of European parsnips. So what we saw when parsnips were growing without webworms, they were not producing as many phracnocoumarins, as did European plants that had constantly maintained an association with webworms. Hard to interpret this as other than a response to webworms. And it also explained a 19th century mystery that probably no one else cared much about. But there are newspaper stories from the late 1870s of unusual poisonings. So the mystery, why parsnips went rogue in the late 19th century. Here you see from the New York Times, 2 children were poisoned today from eating wild parsnip, one of whom died. Here's another story from 1885 from the Bulletin of the Natural Sciences of Philadelphia. The deaths of some children in Danville, Pennsylvania in 1884 caused by the eating of roots of the wild parsnip. People thought it must be the other poisonous plants in the family, like poison hemlock or water hemlock. But the roots had been preserved with teeth marks. There was no chance for error. The root, which was neither of the 2 reportedly virulent plants, was planted, and it was the true garden parsnip, Passamacus sativa, which has become an escape from gardens in many parts in the U.S. Although the evidence that the deaths were from wild roots of the common garden parsnip appeared so conclusive in view of the fact that there seems to be no record of such a virulent character in connection with this plant, it was thought possible there might be still some mistake, and corroborative evidence was sought. And subsequently, it was found that, in fact, these plants do produce toxins, that workmen knew that, and when they engaged in cutting the stalks, they protected their hands and arms. With these facts, it seems worth placing on record what seems to be indisputable: the deaths of the Danville children were really caused by the wild garden parsnip. Post-introduction, there was a hike in the phracnocoumarin content. Lesson 4, any land without your enemies is a land of opportunities. That's what happened when parsnips came here, and we see it here happening again in New Zealand. In 2004, parsnip webworms were first reported for the first time in New Zealand. Again, they're European. Parsnips have been growing in New Zealand for about 150 years. So we started a collaborative project with Margaret Stanley. See how well they do in New Zealand? They're enormous. This is a wild parsnip. So prior to the accidental introduction of the webworms, parsnips have been growing wild and free and unencumbered by enemies for about 150 years. Not so anymore. Around the area of Dunedin, you can see these plants are tremendously hard hit by webworms. They're essentially defenseless. We tracked them for 2 years. Art, by the way, did all the driving here on the other side of the road. And you can see that there are, in subsequent years, 3/4 of the plants didn't even produce seeds. They were that damaged. Spectacularly high densities.